Welcome to study session 11, Expansion and Manifest Destiny, Expansion, Northwest Territory. In the 1780s, there were few white settlers in the Northwest Territory, the state of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and eastern Minnesota. By 1860, more than 1 in 5 Americans lived in the Northwest, and the geographic center of the population of the United States was near Chillicothe, Ohio. Nearly all white migrants were farmers, and they reached the area in 2 streams. Before 1830, most migrants were Southerners, mainly poor and middling farmers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Western Virginia. In the southern regions of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, they settled near rivers. They emptied into the Ohio River, providing access to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. Southern migrants in Northwest worked their land Southern style. They planted cornfields but left most of their land wooded, allowing hogs to roam freely and fend for themselves. In this way, farmers succeeded within their household and through bartering with neighbors, with relatively little labor or reliance on outside markets. Trade down the Mississippi became safe only after Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory in 1803, and the army ended Native American resistance in the Northwest and Southwest in the War of 1812. The trade route became efficient and profitable only with development of river steamboats in the 1810s. After 1830, a new stream of migration reached the Northwest Territory from the northeastern states. Most of the new settlers were New Englanders, many of whom had spent a generation in western New York, who reached their new land via New York's Erie Canal, Great Lakes steamboats, and other new forms of transportation. By the 1840s, they were joined by immigrants from Germany and Scandinavia. Most of these were intensive commercial farmers. Rather than allow cattle and hogs to roam freely, they put their animal in pens. They also planted huge fields of grain and put up fences. In 1820, the Northwest Territory sent only 12% of its farm produce to markets outside the region, a sign that nearly all Northwestern farmers limited their economic lives to their families and neighbors. By 1840, exports accounted for 27% of what Northwestern farmers produced, and by 1860, with railroad connections to the east completed, the figures stood at 70%. The figures were even higher in the northern grain areas. Increasingly, the market for Northwestern farm products was not in Europe but in the towns and cities of the East, as well as such local centers as Cincinnati, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois. In turn, these cities provided farmers with manufactured goods. Land that only a generation earlier had been occupied by independent Native America, people now the center of a great internal commercial revolution. Expansion, the Southwest. Equally dramatic was the rapid settlement of the Trans-Appalachian South. At the conclusion of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson forced the Creeks to cede huge territories in the Southwest. Settlers, often with the help of state governments, began pressuring the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other tribes to give up their lands. The land was eagerly sought by Southern whites, who had small, worn-out farm and who faced lives of tenancy and rural poverty. The best lands, however, were taken by planters who since the 1790s had been reaping huge profits from the cotton boom. Fertile land beside navigable rivers in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri became slave plantations devoted to cotton. These cotton farms were among the largest, the most intensely commercialized, and the most profitable business operations in the West Hemisphere. Farmers who owned few or no slaves took higher, more isolated, and less fertile land in the same state. Like their cousins who settled north of the Ohio River, they practiced a mixed agriculture that included animals and plants, primarily oats and corn, provided for themselves and their neighbors, and sold the surplus to outside markets. Some of these markets were reached by floating produce downriver to the seaports, while other markets were on plantations that grew only cotton and that bought food from farmers in their region. The big cotton farms relied on slave labor, and slaves performed the immense task of turning a huge trans-Appalachian wilderness into cotton farms. Much of the slave population that was moved west came from the slave centers of South Carolina and coastal Georgia. But the cotton boom also provided a market for Virginia and Maryland slaves, who were not as economically useful as they had been in the 18th century. In the 1790s, as the cotton boom began, about 1 in 12 Chesapeake slaves was moved south and west. Chesapeake slave exports rose to 1 in 10 in the first decade of the 19th century and 1 in 5 between 1810 and 1820. The movement of slaves from the Chesapeake of the new cotton states was immense. The cotton belt of the deep South had become the center of American slavery. The Indian Removal Acts. With the expansion of the white agricultural frontier came the final blows to Native American independence east of the Mississippi. In New York, the once mighty Iroquois were limited to reservation near the new towns of Buffalo and Syracuse. Many of the Iroquois moved to Canada. The Shawnee, who had led Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory until 1815, were scattered. Many of the most deviant members moved to Canada. Others relocated to Missouri, then to Mexican Territory in East Texas or to eastern Kansas. In the South, the 60,000 remaining Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were pressured by the national government to sell away most of their land at pennies per acre. Legislation passed in 1819 provided small amount of government money to train southern Native Americans in plowing, agriculture, and Christianity on their reduced lands. The plan took hold among many of them, and whites began calling them the 5 civilized tribes. But even as these efforts continued, settlers moved onto lands that Native Americans had not ceded, while the federal government looked the other way. In his final annual message to Congress in 1824, President James Moore recommended that the indigenous people who remained in the East be removed to new lands west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations rejected the idea of removal and insisted that the national government live up to the treaty that guaranteed them what was left of their territory. At the same time, Southern state government insisted that they and not the federal government had jurisdiction over Native American lands within their borders. The claims reinforced Southern notions of states' rights. It also held the promise of more Native American land for settlers. The situation reached a crisis in Georgia, where Governor George Throop extended state jurisdiction to Native American lands and began giving the lands to poor whites by means of a lottery in 1825. Throop also sent state surveyors onto Creek lands and warned President John Quincy Adams not to interfere with this exercise of state authority. Faced with this threatening situation, the Creek and the Cherokee recognized themselves as political nations, stripping local chiefs of power and giving it to National Council. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation declared itself a republic with its own governments, courts, police, and constitution. By 1830, the situation had become a crisis. New President Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee plantation owner and a famous fighter of Native Americans, refused to exercise federal jurisdiction over Native American affairs, allow Southern states to find their own situations. The Cherokee took the state of Georgia to court, and in 1832, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, ruled that Georgia's extension of its authority over Cherokee land was unconstitutional. President Jackson simply refused to enforce the decision, allowing Southern states to continue to encroach on Native American lands. In the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Congress, with Jackson's blessing, offered Native American peoples east of the Mississippi federal land to the west, where the United States government had the authority to protect them. Many of them accepted. Then in 1838, Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, sent the U.S. Army to evict 18,000 to 20,000 Cherokee remaining in the South and move them to what is today Oklahoma. In all, 4,000 Native Americans died on the march that became known as the Trial of Tears. Jackson, who more than any other person was responsible for this removal policy, argued, what good man would prefer a country covered with forest and raised by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. Again, the white empire of land and liberty came at the expense of other race, the Trans-Mississippi West, 1803 to 1840s. In 1804, a year after the Louisiana Purchase, President Jefferson sent an expedition under Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the purchase and to continue on to the Pacific Ocean. The Lewis and Clark expedition traveled up the Missouri River, spent the winter of 1804 to 1805 with the Mandal people, and with the help of a Sonshon woman named Skajawe, traveled west along the Snake River to the Columbia River and on to the Pacific. Even as they traveled, mounted bands of Sioux were conquering the northern Great Plains. The Sioux had already cut off the Pawnee, Oto, and other peoples of the lower Missouri from the western Buffalo herds and were threatening the Manda and other agricultural peoples on the upper reaches of the river. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, epidemic of European diseases traveled up the Missouri River. The worst of them came in the 1830s when smallpox killed half the Native Americans along the river. The Sioux, who lived in small bands and moved constantly, were not as badly hurt as others were. They used that advantage to complete their conquest of the northern sections of Jefferson's great empire of liberty. Further south, white settlers were crossing the Mississippi onto the new lands. Louisiana, already the sites of New Orleans and of Spanish and French plantations, became the first state west of the Mississippi in 1812. Southerners were also moving into the Arkansas and Missouri territories. Missouri entered the Union in 1821. Arkansas in 1836. Settlers also began moving into Texas in the northeastern reaches of the Republic of Mexico, which won its independence from Spain in 1821. Mexico at first encouraged them, but demanded that new settlers become Catholics and Mexican citizens. Mexico also demanded that they respect the Mexican government's abolition of slavery within its territory. Settlers tended to ignore these demands, and they continued to stream into Texas even when the Mexican government tried to stop the migration. By 1835, the 30,000 Americans in Texas outnumbered Mexicans 6-1. When the Mexican government tried to strengthen its authority in Texas, the American settlers, with the help of many of the Mexicans living in that province, went into an armed revolt known as the Texas Revolution. Volunteers from the southern United States crossed the border to help, and in 1836, the Americans won. They declared their land the Independent Republic of Texas and asked that it be annexed of the United States. The question of Texas annexation will steer national politics for the next 10 years. Americans considered the plains that formed most of the Louisiana Purchase, the land over which the Sioux had established control, to be a desert unsuitable for farming. Congress designated the area west of Arkansas, Missouri, and lower and north of Texas as Indian Territory in 1840s. But Americans were already crossing that ground to reach more fertile territory on the Pacific. In California and Oregon, which included present-day Washington and much of present-day British Columbia. These lands were formerly owned by other countries and occupied by independent indigenous peoples. California was part of Mexico. The Oregon country was jointly occupied by Britain and the United States. American settlers, most of them from the Ohio Valley, crossed the plains and poured into Oregon and the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys in California after 1841. As populations in those areas grew, members of the new Mormon Church, after violent troubles with their neighbors in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, trekked across the plains and the Rocky Mountains in 1847 and settled on Mexican territory in the Salt Lake Valley. The Mormon doctrine. The American government in these years was expansionist. With the end of the Second War between Britain and the United States, the heated foreign policy debate that had divided Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans since the 1790s quieted down. In the years after 1815, most American politicians agreed on an aggressively nationalist and expansionist foreign policy. John Quincy Adams, who served as Secretary of State under James Monroe, did the most to articulate that policy. In the Rush-Bagot Convention of 1870, he worked out agreement with Britain to reduce naval forces on the Great Lakes and establish the U.S.-Canadian border from Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains along the 49th parallel. For the first time in the history, Americans did not have to worry about an unfriendly Canada. Americans turned their attention south and west and to Spain's crumbling empire in the New World. In the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded Florida to the United States. The treaty also established the border between Louisiana and Spanish Texas, a border that ran west along the Arkansas River over the Rocky Mountains and to the Pacific along the present southern border of Idaho and Oregon. Thus, the treaty gave the United States its first claim to land bordering the Pacific Ocean, though it shared that claim with Britain. In part, the Spanish were willing to give up the territory because they had bigger things to worry about. Their South American colonies were in revolt, establishing themselves as independent republics. Spain asked the European powers that had stopped Napoleon's France to help it stop revolutionary republicanism in Spanish America. Britain, however, did not agree and instead proposed a joint British-United States statement in which both nations would oppose European intervention in Latin America and would agree not to annex any of the former Spanish territory. Secretary Adams answered with what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. In it, the United States independently declared that further European colonization in the Americas would be considered an unfriendly act, which agreed with the British proposal. The Monroe Doctrine did not, however, include the British clause that would have prevented annexation of former Spanish territory. Although he had no immediate plans to annex them, Adams believed that at least Texas and Cuba would eventually become American possessions. At the same time, the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the new Latin American republics. In short, the Monroe Doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere close to European colonization, with leaving open the possibility of United States expansion. Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is the historical belief that the United States was divinely ordained and destined to expand across the North American continent, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific Ocean. Sometimes, Manifest Destiny was interpreted so widely as to include the eventual absorption of all North America, Canada, Mexico, Cuba, and Central America. It has also been used to advocate and justify other territorial acquisitions. Advocates of manifest destiny believed that expansion was not only good, but that it was obvious, that is manifest, and certain, that is destiny. Originally, a political catchphrase of the 19th century, manifest destiny, eventually became a standard historical term, sometimes used as a synonym for the expansion of the United States across the North American continent, which they believe inspired or was used to justify. The term was first used primarily by Jacksonian Democrats in the 1840s to promote the annexation of much of what is now the western United States. It was revived in the 1890s, this time with Republican supporters, as a theoretical justification for United States expansion outside of North America. The term fell out of usage by US policymakers early in 20th century, but some commentators believe that aspect of manifest destiny, particularly the belief in an American mission to promote and defend democracy throughout the world, continue to have an influence on American political ideology. Manifest destiny was always a general notion rather than a specific policy. The term combined a belief in expansionism with other popular ideas of the era, including American expansionism, romantic nationalism, and a belief in the natural superiority of what was then called the Anglo-Saxon race. While many writers focus primarily upon American expansionism when discussing manifest destiny, others see in the term a broader expression of a belief in Americans' mission in the world, which has meant different things to different people over the years. The concept of manifest destiny has acquired a variety of meaning over the years, and its inherent ambiguity has been part of its power. In the generic political sense, however, it was usually used to refer to the idea that the American government was destined to establish uninterrupted political authority across the entire North American continent, from one ocean to the other. Journalist John L. Sullivan, an influential advocate for the Democratic Party, wrote an article in 1839 which, while not using the term manifest destiny, did predict a divine destiny for the United States based upon values such as equality, rights of conscience, and personal enfranchisement. Establish on earth the moral dignity and salvation of man. This destiny was not explicitly territorial, but O'Sullivan predicted that the United States would be one of a union of many republics sharing those values. 6 years later, O'Sullivan wrote another essay which first used the phrase manifest destiny. In 1845, he published a piece entitled Annexation in the Democratic Review, in which he urged the United States to annex the Republic of Texas, not only because Texas desired this, but because it was our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Amid much controversy, Texas was annexed shortly thereafter, but O'Sullivan's first usage of the phrase manifest destiny attracted little attention. O'Sullivan's second use of the phrase became extremely influential. On December 27, 1845, in his newspaper, the New York Morning News, O'Sullivan addressed the ongoing boundary dispute with Great Britain in the Oregon country. O'Sullivan argued that the United States had the right to claim the whole of Oregon. Few American migrants questioned their right to move into Texas, Oregon, and California. By the mid-1840s, expansion was supported by a well-developed popular ideology that it was inevitable and good that the United States occupy a continent from sea to shining sea. Some talked of expanding freedom to new areas. Others talked of spreading the American ethic of hard work and economic progress. Still, others imagined a United States with Pacific ports that could open Asian markets. Before long, some were imagining a North American without what they considered the savagery of Native Americans, the laziness and political instability of Mexicans, or the corrupt and dying monarchism of the British. God, they said, clearly wanted hard-working American Republicans to occupy North America. In 1845, a New York City journalist named John L. O'Sullivan gave this idea a name: Manifest Destiny. He wrote, "Our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." Annexation: Oregon and Texas. The new Republic of Texas asked to be annexed to the United States as early as 1837. The government of President Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren took no action for two reasons. First, the question of Texas annexation divided the North and South. Up to the 1840s, Trans-Mississippi expansion had extended Southern society. Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri were all slave states. Texas would be another, and Northerners who disliked slavery and Southern political power imagined that the Texas territory could become as many as 11 new slave states with 22 new pro-slavery senators. Annexation of Texas was certain to arouse Northern and anti-slavery opposition. President John Tyler, who supported the South, tried to annex Texas in 1844 but was defeated by congressional Northerners and by some Southern members of the anti-Jacksonian Whig Party. The second reason for avoiding annexation was that Mexico still considered Texas its own territory. Annexation will create a diplomatic crisis and perhaps lead to war. In the presidential election of 1844, the Whig Party nominated Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay refused to take a stand on the annexation of Texas. The Democrats rejected former President Martin Van Buren, who opposed annexation, and nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee. Polk ran on a pro-annexation platform. He will annex Texas and he will assert American ownership of all of Oregon's territory disputed with Britain. Polk's position on Oregon was intended to reassure Northerners that expansion will benefit them as well as the South. This position of Oregon was, however, a radical change from earlier policies. Previously, Americans had not claimed land north of the 49th parallel, the present-day United States-Canada border on the Pacific. Polk claimed all the land up to 54 degree 40 north, the present southern boundary of Alaska, which at the time was owned by Russia. The British, on the other hand, claimed territory as far south as the Columbia River. After Polk won the election, both sides sought to avoid a serious dispute. They backed down and accepted the boundary that exists today between Washington State and British Columbia. The compromise avoided war, but it convinced northern expansionists that Polk, and behind him the Democratic Party, cared more about southern expansion than about northern expansion. War with Mexico. There was ample reason for that suspicion. While Polk compromised with Britain on the Oregon boundary, he stood adamant against Mexico on the question of Texas. Mexico warned that it would consider the annexation of Texas by the United States a declaration of war. A Texas convention voted to join the Union on July 4, 1845. Polk and a Congress strongly favoring annexation not only offered to take Texas into the Union, they also sent the southern boundary of the new state at the Rio Grande, 150 miles south of what most people had agreed was the Texas-Mexico border. The new boundary gave Texas far more Mexican land, including much of present-day New Mexico and Colorado, than the Texas Revolution had given it. Polk knew that the additional territory would provide a gateway to New Mexico and California, territories of northern Mexico that he and other expansionists converted along with Texas. While annexing Texas, Polk offered to buy New Mexico and California from Mexico for $30 million in late 1845, an offer that the Mexicans angrily refused. Polk then provoked a war with Mexico in which he would win all that he had offered to buy. As Mexico prepared for war, Polk sent troops into the disputed area north of the Rio Grande. Mexico sent troops north of the Rio Grande and in spring 1846 fought a skirmish in which the Americans suffered more than a dozen casualties. Congress declared war on Mexico that May. Near unanimous congressional support for the declaration hid the fact that most Whigs and many Northern Democrats were deeply suspicious of a Southern war to annex new territory for slavery. In the war, the Americans launched a three-pronged offensive. General Zachary Taylor invaded northern Mexico from Texas, capturing the city of Monterrey. In September 1846, a second American army under General Stephen Haney occupied Santa Fe in August of that year. Kenny then sent part of his force to join Taylor at Monterrey and marched the rest of his army west to California, where American settlers had already established an independent bar flag republic. At the same time, the U.S. Navy seized California ports. Having lost Texas, California, New Mexico, and large portions of Chihuahua and Sonora in northern Mexico, the Mexicans marched towards Taylor's army near Monterrey. Taylor held off determined attacks by a Mexican army about 3 times as large as his own and won the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847. The next month, the third prong of the United States offensive was launched when General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz. 5 months later, he had fought his way to Mexico City. As happened in much of the war, the Mexican army was larger and fought bravely, but the Mexican government and high command were divided and often incompetent, and the Americans were better armed and better led. In particular, the Mexicans had no answer to American artillery. After a series of bloody battles in September 1847, Scott's army occupied Mexico City and the war was over. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ceded Texas with the Rio Grande boundary, California, and New Mexico to the United States, which agreed to pay Mexico $15 million. The Mexican cession gave the United States present-day West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, and part of Wyoming. The northern third of Mexico had become the southwestern quarter of the United States. The Mexican War was a straightforward land grab. The ease with which the United States won and the arrogance with which it behaved created a distrustful and sometimes violent southern border area for the country. More immediately, the land ceded by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo became the object of contest and resentment between the slave and the free states, a conflict that widened into the American Civil War 13 years later. This is the end of study session 11. Thank you for listening.